Welcome to Soul Sense Podcast. Today I've got a special guest, a licensed therapist from Fort Collins, Colorado, and he's host of the very popular The Place We Find Ourselves podcast. Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
So glad to have you today. I know our topic really is going to be talking about grieving, and we'll just see where that leads us today. I so enjoyed your podcasts that start in the early 130s to the high 130s. There's probably at least 4 or 5 podcasts there that were just, really intriguing and helpful. I've sent them to several of my clients. What got you on that topic kind of to start with, back there? I think you did those podcasts probably last year.
Well, grief was always difficult for me. And when I first started learning about my story and engaging my story at the Allender Center, they talked about the importance of grief in the healing process.
Okay.
And it was very difficult for me to access grief, to find my tears. That was a very difficult thing for me to do. And so my interest in grief is autobiographical. I mean, it has been incredibly healing for me personally to find tears for the boy in my stories, because I did not have tears for him for a long time.
What were some of the steps that helped you? I know that's the kind of thing I'm working with clients kind of day in and day out. But what were a couple of the steps that really helped you find the tears? Because, when I think about so many people that come in, I'm looking for things that have been left way behind or left long behind. It's grief, it's trauma, it's whatever kind of abuse. But you've walked away from it. You've left it behind. But what were a couple of the steps that really helped you, Adam?
Well, the biggest one was being named accurately in the context of my story.
Okay.
So, and that takes another person. We can't do that by ourselves. So I'm fond of saying that you really can't heal with a Bible, a cup of coffee, a journal, and a good view out your window. You need other people to not only bear witness to your story, but to name you accurately in the context of the stories that are yours, and you think you know them, but you don't until you hear the reaction of others.
Wow. So really it was your time at the Allender Center that you had some others speak into that.
That's
Is that
right.
kind of what you're saying?
That's right. I had facilitators. I was in a group with a trained facilitator, and she spoke into my story in very particular ways. And what I mean by that is, I would read a story from when I was 8, 10, 12, 16 years
Okay.
old, and she would help put language to the humiliation that boy bore, or
Mm-hmm.
the rage that boy had but couldn't express. She would help name the dynamics going on in my family of origin in ways that, of course, my body knew, but I did not know because I had not yet named.
Oh, that's really profound. I mean, and one of the ways that I'll do that with clients is have them write a letter to that 7-year-old and then, read it in a session. Or of course, if you're in a group, you could read it in a group. But you're not just grieving for that 8-year-old or 6-year-old. You're also grieving for what he didn't get and some of the different things in those family dynamics, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we have grief for both overt abuse, and we have grief for what we needed but went unmet. So
Yes.
there is immense grief in many people, I think, particularly in our cultural moment, for the lack, the gap, the absence of good care, good comfort, good presence, good guidance and initiation. So many people today as adults were not initiated into being a man or a woman. We didn't have elders, and I don't just mean parents. I mean, we didn't
Sure.
have respected elders in our lives, in our communities, who could initiate us into what it means to be a functioning adult. And so you have to grieve the lack of what you were meant for and did not receive.
Yeah, I have to say that's a great way to put it. I heard this story once of a missionary. It was a husband and wife team, and they just went on the mission field to a third world country. And they actually went to a culture that really knew how to grieve. And apparently the elders stepped up. As a matter of fact, only been there a couple weeks. It was sometime in May. As a matter of fact, they were kind of feeling melancholy because it was the time of the Kentucky Derby, and that'd been a really big part of their life. So they had heard on a Friday night that an elder had died. They didn't know him, but he wanted to go pay his respects up in the village. So the next morning he was a little melancholy. It's the day of the Kentucky Derby, and he's heard the news about the village, even though he doesn't know him. So he goes up and he's tearing up just a little bit. And later he got the whole story, but at the moment it played out like this. They look over and go, "Oh, white man cries." And two of
Mhm.
the villagers ran over and tackled him and wrestled him to the ground because in their custom, in their village, if you cry a little, they help you get all of it out.
Right. That's right. That's
It
right.
we have to have ways of doing it. We may not tackle somebody, but
That's right.
talk to us a little more about getting it out, because I mean that is so key. And it seems like, doesn't it seem like for you a lot of times it's even harder for the men than the women typically.
Well, I think generally speaking, that's true. But many, many women are crying alone. And that is
Okay.
very different than crying
Okay.
with a witness.
That's
So
good.
the story that you share reminds me of the book The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Weller, which I mentioned on
Okay.
my podcast and has been super helpful for me. And Francis Weller points out that in many contemporary societies, particularly white societies in America, we lack the village. Now, what does he
Mm,
mean by the village? The village are the elders of the community who have, and what is an elder? An elder is someone who knows how to use their wounding on behalf of the suffering and use their authority and their power on behalf of the similarly wounded. And we are very often 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years
right.
old, trying to make sense of our wounds and heal. And there is no village. There are
Oh
no
wow.
elders to
We're
weep
crying
with
alone.
us. We're crying alone. And frankly, I have not experienced much difference between women and men in that regard.
Okay. 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 And it brings to mind that scripture that the Bible is so clear on: weep with those who weep,
Yes,
rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. There's a picture of community here.
that's right. That's right. But when was the last time you were in a sanctuary and there was people weeping with those who were weeping? Now there might
Yeah.
be tears in a sanctuary, but very often it's tears of joy. And
Yeah.
so what I would say is Paul's exhortation is to live the both and of the death and resurrection of Christ.
Mm,
That's where that verse flows out of. It's
mm.
flowing out of his theology of the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, and holding both of those together. And if you are able to do that, as Dan Allender says, you are one of the most powerful people in your community. Very few
Wow.
people can hold both the death of Christ, i.e., can you weep with those who are suffering without fixing it? Can you just
Yes.
be with them in
Yes.
their anguish? And then, if you can you likewise rejoice with them when they are rejoicing? When God surprises them with some measure of healing and rescue, can you equally rejoice? So the question is, are you able to move from sorrow and tears to celebration and joy with flexibility and quickness? If you are, you know something of the death and the resurrection of Jesus.
That is a profound way of putting it. And it is true. You rarely find people that are agile on both
Agile.
sides,
That's right.
right?
That's
I
right.
mean, the only way is if they've faced that in their own lives.
That's absolutely right. And so you cannot obey Paul's admonition there if you have not engaged your own heartache, your own suffering, your own sorrows. And when I say engage them, please understand, I mean with another person or
Yes.
persons. You
Yes.
cannot grieve only alone. You can grieve alone, but if you
Right.
are only grieving alone, then you are missing something of the mediating, healing presence of God. Because God is a triune God. And where is the resurrected Christ? If you ask Paul, where is the resurrected Christ? He would have pointed to the church. He would have pointed to other Christians and said, there, there, and there. So until that comforting presence of God is mediated to you through the body of Christ, i.e., other Christians, there's a sense in which you are very lonely in your pain.
Absolutely. And you know what comes to mind first, a couple things, but one of them is Matthew 18, where two or more are gathered, I'm in their midst. And so
Mm-hmm.
if two of us are grieving together, the Lord is grieving with us. But I
Mm-hmm.
have to tell you something, Adam. Years ago, I had a lady that came in, had been grieving alone a lot and just really crying her eyes out. And she went to the Lord in kind of a complaint. She was tired of crying. And she said she went to the Lord and is like, Lord, I'm like crying my eyes out. I've cried gallons of tears. What is the deal? And he didn't. She said she got quiet and she got this sense that the Lord's asked a question. Why do you think I put your tears in a public place?
Mm-hmm.
I could have made your tears on your body in a private place, but I
Right,
didn't.
right, right, right.
It's a test for you and it's a test for others. Will you humble yourself before others, because it takes humility to cry in front of others. It takes humility and brokenness, but then again, there's part of our momentum for healing. He opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And so there's so much that that works into that. But Adam, could you give an example of maybe of someone you worked with, or even of yourself again, of part of this process of breaking through to grieve in front of others?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was at the Allender Center and I had really screwed something up. I was engaging somebody else's story and I did not do a good job of it. And somebody else had to kind of take the microphone, not the microphone, there was no microphone, but take
Yeah,
charge.
yeah.
And at the end, they were debriefing with me. He was debriefing with me, the facilitator. And I was so undone by my failure. I just felt I had such a longing to do well, and I had done so poorly for a variety of reasons. And so I was sitting in the grief of the unmet longing to be a better lover of this man's heart
Right.
and whose story I was engaging, and I had failed him. And what Trapper, the facilitator, did was uh, he said, what would it be like for you, Adam, as you're crying, if there were six other people in the group, if each of us could just put our hands, on your back, on your shoulders, on your arms, on your feet, and just be with you in that. And boy, oh
Yeah.
boy, that
Oh
was
wow.
immensely vulnerable and immensely healing to my heart. And so for a minute, they just put their hands on me and they were just with me, bearing witness to the agony of my sorrow. And I'll never
Wow.
forget it.
Wow. They were bearing witness and they were bearing the burden with you.
Yes, that's right.
That's so beautiful because Galatians 6:2 says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And that word for burden means heaviness, weight, burden, or trouble. So without words, as a matter of fact, words may have detracted, right, from it.
Yeah, there were
It's
no
like,
words.
yeah, it's just the presence and the connection and the laying on
Yes.
of hands.
Yes.
We're with you.
Yes.
Like your family's with you.
Yes. Mhm.
Oh, I love that. One of the things, Adam, is I was listening to your podcast about grief, and I was really intrigued by some of the things that you brought in about ritual.
Uh-huh.
Could you talk some about ritual and some of the significance of that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. So ritual is incredibly important because one of the things Christians need to come to terms with is we are embodied creatures. Okay,
Yes.
we are, the incarnation means that God has blessed the body, and even just the
Yes.
creation of us as human beings as embodied. We are not spirits that are
Yes.
just hovering around. We have bodies. And that means that we have senses that move through time and space. As a result, we are created for engagement with the natural world. And the natural world is full of symbol. So, trees, seasons,
Mhm.
water,
Mhm.
earth, these things are designed by God to ground, to settle, to orient, to
Mhm.
integrate our brains, frankly,
Mhm. Mhm.
through the mercy of the natural world and the leadership of the natural world. But we live in a culture that is either suspicious of ritual or I should say, and or has lost, for the most part, particularly in white spaces, has lost connection to ritual. And what is ritual? Ritual is using the elements of the earth with our bodies, in conjunction with our bodies, and symbolic meanings to do things, to
Okay.
pass through things. So, as simple as opening my hands
Mhm.
and receiving water being poured on them, if you
Mhm.
do something as simple as that, you are going to feel some sensations in your body. Your body feels differently when your fists are closed than
Okay.
when your hands are open.
Oh,
That's
right.
because you are embodied and you're designed for ritual. The Bible is not short on ritual. Our culture is.
Oh, yes. I'm thinking about laying prostrate, getting on your knees.
That's
Yeah,
right.
Moses
Yeah,
raising his staff, and
that's right.
man, it's from A to Z, isn't it?
Yes. And so rituals help put the past in the past. Rituals help break curses. Rituals help bless glory and goodness. And it's not enough just to use your words. You have to get your body involved, and that's what rituals do. Rituals are the involvement of the body with God's created natural world to mark things.
Hmm. Wow. Tell us another example that you've experienced or you've helped people with in regard to rituals.
About taking somebody through a ritual?
Yeah, taking someone through a ritual.
Well, the thing about rituals is they can be created kind of on the spot, but
Okay.
they always have to be related to story. So
Okay.
whatever ritual I would invite you to step into would be different than the ritual that I might invite someone else to step into. Why?
Okay.
Because you have different stories. You have different places where you have been harmed. You have
Mhm.
different stories of heartache. You have different places where you have been cursed. So, for example, it's very common for me to work with women whose voice has been cursed,
Oh, sure.
whose sensitivity has been cursed. And all I mean by cursed is that their father said, "You're a drama queen." You
Right.
know, their coach, their community, their youth pastor, their stepdad said, "You're always over dramatic. You're always blowing things out of proportion.
Mhm.
You're such a drama queen." Okay,
Yes.
that's a naming. It's a blessing
Yes.
in the negative, which is to say it's a
Yes.
cursing. And
Yeah,
when
it's
that
an
gets
opposite. Yeah.
Yes, when that gets spoken over you, you have to understand that has efficacy in the spiritual realm. Okay,
Yes.
that curses, blessings, pronouncements
Mhm.
over you have efficacy in the spiritual realm. And what I mean by that is they're operative in your life until you address them. And so,
Yes.
what would it be like for someone whose voice has been cursed to
Mhm.
take them up on a hike to a high place and for them to not just speak some words, but to scream some words
Oh,
into
yes.
the air? So I live
Yes.
in Colorado. There's a lot of high places.
Oh, sure.
Breckenridge, Colorado. You can go up to the top of Breckenridge, the highest lift in North America, and you are so high. And there's a sense in which, what would it be like to take your helmet off and scream some words
I love
up
that.
there? That's a ritual, as long as it's witnessed by another.
I love that, as long as it's witnessed.
Yes.
Let me ask if you would consider this a ritual. Very early in my career, I worked at the Dallas Suicide and Crisis Center, and we had a survivors of suicide group. And at the end of the group, one of the last things is we do a one-on-one session to help uh, pull out, as much grief as we can. And I had probably an early 60s man. I think his brother had suicided 30 plus years before, but he was still carrying it decades later.
Sure, sure.
And so we talked a little bit. I knew his story. I'd already been leading the group for several weeks, but I sat him down and we put an empty chair over here. And I just said, describe your brother the way you remember him if he's sitting in that chair. And
Yeah.
so he took a few moments to do it. And then I said, I want you to tell your brother everything you need to tell him. You feel guilty, you feel condemned, it was your fault, or you should have caught something, or anything else. Just tell him anything that's on your heart. And he was weeping and weeping, and he apologized, he begged forgiveness. Of course,
Yeah.
he was kind of blaming it on himself. But one of the things about getting it out, and I know you know this, Adam, is you don't stop and address those things as you're doing it. You just let
Mm.
it come out. And then I asked him, I said, now I want you to go sit in his chair. And I just want you to respond how you think he would respond.
Mm.
And it was so beautiful. He was still weeping, but he said, brother, I don't hold anything against you. I
Mhm.
forgive you. Let it go.
Mhm.
And it was like such a turning point. And I suppose maybe that's a type of ritual too, right?
Well, I'm not an expert on ritual.
Yeah.
The person, I think of Francis Weller, I think of Heather Stringer. These people are kind of experts on ritual. My understanding of the definition of ritual is that it usually has to involve either an element or some sort of object or
Okay.
some sort of bodily motion
Like high
that
on the mountain would be that.
yeah,
Yeah.
or that has symbolic meaning, bodily motion
Sure.
that has symbolic meaning beyond words. I mean, words need to be included. Words matter immensely. But where we're lacking in our culture is the use of our body as an instrument of healing. We are very reluctant to take our bodies
Okay.
seriously. What
Okay.
you were doing in that illustration is that man, when he was speaking to his dead brother, he's feeling immense feelings because of the psychodrama that you have set up.
Right.
And without that empty chair and without the setting, he's not going
Mhm.
to be able to access those feelings as readily.
Mhm. Mhm. That makes sense. Adam, what would you say, just from what I'm hearing, do you think it with most people that, some loss has happened a year or two or 5 or 10 years ago, do you think it's much more common that they haven't accessed it versus they're kind of stuck in it? Or
Well,
how
I,
would
I
you?
think those are synonyms very
Okay,
often.
okay.
In other words, what is not engaged, what is not addressed, what is not named, what is not felt will inevitably keep us stuck.
Okay.
So many people think that it's too painful to look at it and it's going to suck me under, and I need to be a functioning father, husband, coworker, so I
Mhm.
can't afford to go there. And what I would say is it's already affecting you and it's coming out sideways in so many aspects that you're unaware of, perhaps.
Hmm.
But being stuck with unaddressed grief is exhausting.
Oh my goodness. How much energy it takes, right?
Yeah,
To keep it
yes.
at bay.
That's right.
It's a force that you're keeping at bay, and it
That's
takes
right.
energy 24/7.
That's right. Yep.
Wow. I just realized, Adam, when you were talking about that I use a small ritual a lot of times when someone gets to a place where oh no, it will be too much for me to handle. It's better for me to keep it buried. I have them just imagine that they're holding like a sign in their hands, and on the sign is written, "Oh, this is too much to take." And I just have them hold it up to the Lord. And we just say, "Okay, we're just going to hold this up and we're going to say, God, is this true?" And I will tell you, Adam, it seems like at least 19 out of 20 times they'll go, "No, it's not true." And then we just move on, you know?
Mhm.
But you're right. Some of those things, until you address it, people don't even know that it's a small strategic belief that's keeping them from moving into it. I mean, the
Yes.
Bible says God is the God of all comfort. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. So we know from scripture, but we know from our own lives, if we've gotten to a place where we can be agile, like we said, that God will meet us no matter how bad or how painful, something is. You've already given us some examples, but anything come to mind as far as, oh, here's this deep pain and there was grace and God met me there, or met someone I worked with in that very deep pain?
Well, let me speak to what you've just said first. We
Okay.
know in our left hemispheres that
Mm-hmm.
God comforts, that He's the
Right.
God of all comfort. But people, especially people who have a history of trauma,
Okay.
do not have an embodied right hemisphere limbic experience of receiving comfort from other caring human beings. And as
Okay.
a result, whatever the Bible says, it doesn't matter to their body
They
because
need an experiential.
yes, if their nervous system has no experiences of good, kind, caring comfort,
Yes.
then it doesn't matter that they know the Bible verse. They are not going to be inclined to reach for God's help. They are not going to be inclined to mourn.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because their nervous system knows that anytime they cry, they are alone.
Oh, right. That's where they need that elder that you were talking about, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. What are some other things that come to your mind? I know we've talked about ritual, we've talked about going to the pain and the need for community. What are some other things that you might add about grieving that are on your heart right now?
Well, the first thing is that you don't have to learn to grieve. Okay,
Okay.
the human body knows how to grieve naturally.
Okay.
So a lot of people will say, I know I need to grieve, I just don't know how."
Hmm.
Baloney. It's that's not really true. If you look at any 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old, when they fall off their bike or their skateboard and skin their knee, they run to the nearest caring attachment figure and they cry. It's just
Yes.
natural. We
Yes.
reach for comfort naturally. Now, the question is, if you find yourself as a 45-year-old woman and you're like, I don't know how to grieve, well, there's a reason for that.
Yes.
Because as a 5-year-old girl, a 6-year-old girl, 7-year-old girl, somewhere along the line, you learned that there would be no one there for you in
Yes.
your tears. Or worse, you were shamed for your tears. How many boys heard, big boys don't cry. And
Right.
so you're shamed for your tears, or you are dismissed when you are in sorrow. And so, in that sense, your body, your brain, the neurons in your brain have learned there is no one to help me when I am grieving. So, the first thing I want to say is you don't need to learn how to grieve. You need to engage your story with regard to past sorrow and
That's good.
find out what it was like for you as a boy or a girl or an adolescent that made you stop crying, stop reaching for help, because that stuff is instoried. In other words, it is hardwired into every human being when you come out of the womb to reach for help, to run for help, to cry. That's just how we're built.
Yes.
If that process has stopped, well, there's a reason for that, a good reason.
That's so well put. And so we have to access that story. We have to access it with someone else, not just alone with our coffee, like you were saying, with a nice view. We have to do it in community. But we didn't talk about it, I don't think, today, but one of the things that you would use together in talking about grieving was community and containment. Could you
Yes.
talk about that word containment for a minute?
Sure.
Because I think that could be a
Sure.
little confusing.
Sure. Well, this goes back to the idea of the village and what Francis Weller means by the village. The
Uh-huh.
village refers to the elders, and the elders are men and women who have suffered their sufferings
Hmm.
and therefore have been sanctified, matured. They have grown into their masculinity and femininity, and they
Mm-hmm.
know how to bring containment to another person's pain. What do I mean by that? Well, think of a container like a glass or a jar. You pour water into it, it holds the water, it contains it. When
Hmm.
someone is deeply dysregulated because they are grieving, because they are in pain, because they are hurting, one of the things that person needs is another human being whose presence can bring some containing, some
Yes.
holding to their pain. And when you are with someone who is just as uncomfortable with your pain, if not more so than you
Right.
are,
Right.
that feels very, very unsafe because they are
Yes.
not a containing presence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I get it. So it's like when we talk about community, it's not just showing up, but it's having my heart open, almost like I'm going with a bucket or a glass to help they can pour that grief into that.
And you'll be there with them and you will just it's Emmanuel. You'll just be with
Yes.
them. And very few people have the maturity to do that.
One of my favorite stories that I read years ago by an author named Neil Anderson, he's retired now, but he talked about his very first pastorate. He had just moved in. He had probably been at the church for 1 or 2 weeks, barely knew anyone. And he gets this late night phone call. One of our leading couples, their 18-year-old son, has been in a terrible motorcycle accident. He rushes over to the hospital and he's there from like 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. And he's in shock. He doesn't really
Right.
know them, but he doesn't know what to say.
Right.
He has a couple prayers, but he just sits with them all night.
Right.
And the tragic news at about 4 a.m. or something, the surgeon comes out and said, "I'm sorry, we couldn't save him."
Right.
And he walked away from that really feeling like a failure for months. He
Right.
wasn't involved in the funeral or anything like that, and the people were moving at the time, so he didn't have a chance to talk to them. But about 6 months later, he uh, got to have a visit with them. I think he was going into a breakfast place and they were coming out, and they came over and just smiled and cried and said, "Thank you so much for
Right.
helping us that night." And he
Right.
said, "Oh, I felt like such a failure. I didn't know what to
Yeah.
say." And they said, "No, you were there with us in the pain."
Right. That's right.
Somehow he brought the community and the containment, and he learned something beautiful, that it's not about words to say. It's
Right.
about being there to help, just again, to help bear that burden.
Right. Yes. And that reminds me of a book, a recently published book called As Long as You Need by J.S. Park, that he's a
Hmm.
hospital chaplain in a trauma one hospital. And he has so many stories and vignettes like that, where he's talking about what people in immense grief actually need from ministers, chaplains, caring, loving other people. And the biggest thing they need is presence. They,
Presence.
presence. However, if you have not suffered your own suffering, the presence that you offer will be lacking.
That's good, Adam. And wouldn't you say, though, that if you begin with the presence, you're kind of going to be forced to face your own grief because you're going to be being triggered.
Yes, that's
Kind of
right.
like a counselor in their early years, right? Every trigger that can be pushed, every button that can be pushed.
Yes, if you are open to the anguish of another and you let what's called the resonant circuitry of your brain, it's very
Uh-huh.
particular neural circuits. We don't need to get into the neurobiology, but they've
Sure.
mapped it. The resonant circuitry of your brain will activate, and through this mirror neuron process, you will feel something of what the other person in immense grief is feeling. And that will
Yes.
inevitably connect you to your own grief, your own anguish, your own helplessness, your own humiliation, whatever it is. And so that is what maturity is calling us into. Will I love another enough to feel my own feelings so that I can
Yes.
be with them in theirs?
Oh, that is a wonderful way to put it. And maybe a way for us to kind of start wrapping it up. But I want to make sure if there's any other points that you want to bring in, please do that. And by the way, we'll make sure that those 2 or 3 books you referenced are on our podcast links also, because I want to read that. Did you say by Park? I want to read
Yes,
that book.
J.S. Park. His first name is June, Joon, but
Okay.
the author citation is J.S. Park. As long as you need. It's a
As long as you need.
wonderful book from a first person, a chaplain, first person accounts, and it details his experience walking with people, as he puts it, who are having the worst day of their life.
Oh, there you go. Wow.
And
Wow.
that's what Neil Anderson walked into as he
That's
was an
right.
early pastor. They were having the worst day of their life. And he left at 4 or 5 a.m. thinking, I did not minister Christ's love to them. They told him that he was wrong.
Yes. Yes. They told him he was wrong. He came and he joined them in that worst day. That's
Yes.
right.
That's right.
Wow,
And the
this is
world,
yeah.
the world would be an utterly different place if we simply brought our presence and our touch to other people in agony instead of trying to fix them. Most of us speak not because we have something helpful to say. We speak words of quote unquote comfort to make our pain and dysregulation go down. And that drives me crazy because it is antithetical to the gospel of Jesus.
Well, and it reminds me of the quote by Saint Francis of Assisi: "Preach the gospel today, and if
Yeah.
necessary, use words."
Yeah.
But that's like grieving. The grieving is the presence and the community, the containment. And you're right. I do see that over and over.
Mhm.
And it is such a blessing when that can be set aside. And I may feel some of that inside. I certainly may
Yes.
process that. But I'm more focused on loving this person and
Mhm.
letting it pour out than I
Yep.
am on even what's, n- tending to my pain.
Mhm.
Adam, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I so appreciate you coming on with us, and tell us a little about. I know you've got a practice in Fort Collins, right,
Mhm.
Colorado. Tell us a little about your practice and how we can reach you and get on your podcast. They're great, by the way. His podcasts are
Sure.
great.
Thanks. Yeah. So I host the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. You can get it anywhere you get podcasts. I have a book coming out in March called Make Sense of Your Story,
Oh,
which goes
wow.
into much more detail about things that we talked about today. And I have a therapy practice here in Fort Collins, Colorado. My website is adamyoungcounseling.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great blessing, and I hope you and your family have a great rest of the summer.
Thank you. It was fun. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Enjoyed it, Adam. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do us a favor and like, subscribe, and share with others who might need it. And you can find additional resources at SamaritansWell.com.